Henry County judge ordered school teacher Rodger Loftin to remain jailed without bond on child sex charges.
That ruling could mean that the investigation into Loftin is widening. News 4's Jacqueline Lambert joins us right now in the studio with the latest on this disturbing story. Jacqueline?
Rodger Loftin taught at Abbeville Christian Academy, and from appearances, he seemed like a pillar of the community. At least he was until Tuesday. That's when state investigators charged him with child exploitation-related allegations. They accused him with intent to disseminate pornography and electronic solicitation of children for sexual purposes. Charging documents also claim Loftin asked boys in their mid-teens to send him photos of their privates. Henry County District Judge Spence Danzy ordered Loftin, a 54-year-old married Abbeville Christian Academy teacher, be held without bond. That ruling is an indication this investigation may not be over, and there potentially could be other children involved and other charges coming. Court filings did not suggest his alleged victims are from the Abbeville area. The tips of alleged sexual misconduct come from Internet Crimes Against Children, an internet watchdog whose mission is to protect children from online predators.
You send your kids to school and you feel like they're safe and everything else. So the last thing that you would want would be, a sexual predator in that environment. That no matter who the person is or where they're at, everybody's going to be held accountable for their actions.
Sheriff Blankenship stressed that he is speaking in general terms and is referring to questions about Loftin's case to the State Bureau of Investigation. There is something else concerning. Loftin has been a foster parent. However, nothing in the charging document suggests any of his foster children are his victims. We reached out to Abbeville Christian Academy for comment about this, and they responded just moments ago, stating that they are taking these allegations very seriously and are cooperating with this investigation.